and welcome to the 55th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century Anglophone women's novel. I have begun a discussion of Tsitsi Dangarembga's nervous conditions in the previous lecture, and I'll spend some time wrapping up that discussion and briefly introduce the next novelist and book in the series in this lecture. I mentioned the French philosophical and colonial thinking that informed the title of this Zimbabwean Anglophone novel, Nervous Conditions, in the previous lecture. I want to talk a little bit about two important thematic events that shape the experience of reading this novel and which shape the trajectory that the protagonist and narrator, Tambu, comes to have in this novel. These two very important thematic events have to do with education, instantiated through the conflict around questions of reading. That is, what should an African child read and what shouldn't the African girl child read? And the second is the thematic development of food. What is the value of food, the nutritional value of food, but also more importantly, the social value or the social meaning that this need for nutrition comes to have. Where does food come from and what does it do? What is the origin of food, which comes from a very particular set of human relationships and a very particular kind of valuation of the labor of some human beings. It's an extremely gendered and raced question, the origin of food. But more importantly also, and in some ways as important as the question of the social relations signified by the origin of food, are the social relations signified by the implications of food, or what sort of social relations does the act of feeding someone imply? If someone provides food for someone else, are they trying to ensure that certain kinds of social relationships are consolidated, enforced, replicated, reproduced? Or is there room for critique? Is there room for departure from conventional scripts? This becomes a very important and disturbing question with violent consequences for the character Nyasha in Nervous Conditions. So I'll talk a little bit about these two thematic threads which run through and shape the novel, and then quickly move on to making some comments about the next novelist and book in the series. So food is important, and the novel begins with this very arresting quote which I read out in the previous lecture. It is that I was not sorry when my brother died. The novel has several descriptions of the narrator and the protagonist, Tambu, cooking. This is in the early part of the novel, that is before she has received the support, the financial support, most importantly, but also a kind of cultural and emotional support from her uncle, Baba Mukuru, who has returned with several master's degrees from England and has undertaken the apparently very edifying and ennobling task of developing this backward, colonized region of southern Rhodesia. Also, incidentally, the year the novel ends, that is 1988, is the year that southern Rhodesia threw the shackles of colonialism and emerged as an independent nation, that of Zimbabwe. That is where the novel ends. That is where the protagonist stops her narration, announces that she has secured admission to a very promising undergraduate institution, university, and this promises secure, stable, and a good life, a better life than was fated for her, than what was in store for Tambu if the events beginning from the first page of the novel had not unfolded. So the novel ends by affirming a very clear, positive progressive development. This is one way to read the beginning and the end of the novel. When the novel begins, the narrator is cooking while her brother is being sent to school. When the novel ends, the brother is no longer alive, obviously. This happens in the very first page. But more importantly, the narrator is not confined to these tasks of domestic labor and drudgery. Instead, the narrator has the opportunity to make a life for herself, to exercise the choice which we take to be the fundamental and most basic right of being human. The very possibilities that are open to us as surely as the day we are born. These rights, these choices were not available to her, and they are available to her. So, in a very obvious sense, this is a novel of progress, a novel of success, a novel of hope and optimism. That despite circumstances that would have dictated otherwise, here is a woman who is set, who is on course to establishing the path that her life will take through an exercise of her choice. This is one way to read the novel, and this is not inaccurate, but this way of reading the novel must be set against other developments which describe a somewhat less optimistic picture. This less optimistic picture emerges because of what Tambu witnesses happening to Nyasha. Now, Tambu and Nyasha are contemporaries, but they have slightly different upbringings. Tambu has never left Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, and in fact has never left the impoverished rural homestead where she has lived. In fact, she leaves to get an education, to move to this women's missionary convent because she gets the mentorship and the support of Baba Mukuru. And she goes and lives in his house. This is Tambu. Nyasha, on the other hand, has had a very different kind of cultural linguistic exposure. Because Baba Mukuru has spent many years getting an education in England, his daughter Nyasha has spent some time with him there. And at the time the novel begins, Nyasha has returned to Rhodesia, to Africa, to the very colonial frame of missionary Anglophone education in southern Rhodesia after having exposed herself to a few years of what can be called a Western, more liberal, more permissive environment. This is an environment in which individual choices given way more freedom. Individuals are encouraged to think more freely and to act on those thoughts, to make choices, and society exists to support those choices. Unfortunately for Nyasha, after only a few years of primary and maybe middle school education, she has had to return to Rhodesia and to a very particular culturally hybrid environment. Now, a quick word about this kind of culturally hybrid environment. Post-colonial nations often have these kinds of hybrid environments. This is an environment in which some natives have the cultural education and the cultural lenses or the frames that have been given to them by an education that they received from the colonizing state. This is true of many nations in South Asia, definitely true of India, and this is also true of many African nations. So this is also why we can speak about post-colonial literature and culture in a somewhat general and generalizing tone. So what is this cultural hybridity? An education in English literature, an education that comprises the study of science, Western science, which is communicated in the English language. All of this produces a sensibility. This implication and this enforcement of a colonial education in the English language in England's colonies was itself done with a very particular colonizing agenda. The agenda was and I'm quoting from Thomas Babington Macaulay's very notorious and very widely criticized document, which is Minutes from 1835. Now, in that document, we get a very colonial vision of why an Anglophone or Western education should be imparted to the natives in English colonies. That colonizing aim was to create a class of natives who would be bichromatic, that is, who would have darker skins, but who would have the cultural sensibility that was held by people with lighter skins. And the British government, the monarchy, was convinced that this would be a good way, the most profitable way to ensure that England's material interests would be protected. That is to say, they would not have to send too many educated, professional individuals from England, that is, white people from England, to manage the governmental and the logistical affairs of the British Empire. But this could be done in a more cost-effective manner by spending less money, by imparting a minimal amount of English education or Western sensibility to a select group of natives. And we can see the long-term consequences of this sort of a colonizing strategy, a very effective strategy, a strategy that's described by the phrase colonial governmentality by anthropologists like Bernard Cohn and several others who take the term governmentality from Michel Foucault and then who combine it with anthropological and historical studies in 19th century colonial spaces. So, colonial governmentality, we see the long-term consequences of colonial governmentality in the figure of Baba Mukuru. And there are these sort of figures that are present in several post-colonial novels, and one can even be more specific and say that these figures persist in many 20th century Anglophone novels by women writers. And those of you who are familiar with the work of Arundhati Roy will immediately recognize the character Chaco. Chaco is Amu's brother and is an extremely violent, abusive, patriarchal sort of character. And much of his violence, much of his abusive tendencies, much of his what can be called a lack of imagination, a very stunted worldview, which legitimizes violence by making him blind or insensitive to certain experiences and certain worldviews. Much of that, Arundhati Roy's narrative convinces us, comes not only from a kind of intrinsic personality trait, but also from the strange combination of South Asian masculinity, which is given a kind of trigger or a kind of turbocharge in this kind of violence by this English education. So in The God of Small Things, Chaco has a couple of master's degrees from Oxford and returns with this very, very imposing sort of and very domineering sort of personality, trying to control the lives and affairs of everyone, but especially the women in his family in Kerala. And it is uncanny, and I'm not sure how much dialogue exists in terms of recorded or written acknowledgements between Arundhati Roy's novel and Tsitsi Dangarembga's novel, but both of these writers are extremely eloquent, extremely powerful chroniclers of the private lives of their home nations, and they do this very powerful anthropological and allegorical work, something which Tanika Sarkar a long time ago described in her essay Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, while writing about Tagore's novel The Home and the World, or Ghore Baire. It's an allegorical move which Sarkar identifies in Tagore's novel, and the move is that by describing very sensitively and critically the dynamics that unfold between the husband and the wife in an upper caste Bengali a Hindu household, the novelist or the narrator is able to put their finger on the pulse of the nation and the region as a whole. So Goribaire begins by describing relationships between a man and his wife, that is Bimla and Nikhil. But through that, the novel gains the authority and the scope with which to describe what's going on in the region as a whole, and how colonialism has complicated relations not only between the white administrators and the brown skinned natives, but also between natives, so to speak, between man and wife. And that tradition, that very powerful tradition of novel writing, of the post colonial novel, as having this kind of allegorical power to move from the personal to the political, and of describing the personal as a way of diagnosing the political. We can see this very powerful tradition continue in different regions as well as in different historical contexts. So, to return to Baba Mukuru, an extremely violent character, the language that's used in a lot of discourse on masculinity, Baba Mukuru signifies the most violent and despicable traits of masculinity. And it's very difficult to read for us when we're reading this novel. It's difficult to read the pain and the discomfort that this kind of violence produces for his daughter, Nyasha. There's graphic descriptions of a lot of physical as well as emotional violence. And the novel makes it very clear that it is education that has a very big role to play in enabling this kind of violence. Specifically, the combination of Baba Mukuru's African origins, the particular kind of masculinity that his African origins produce, and how that masculinity and race and ethnicity combined with the colonial context in which blackness is seen as inferior, and this inferiority produces a very poisonous sort of insecurity in men like Baba Mukuru, and how they try to compensate for this insecurity by combining with it the sensibilities they get from a Western or an English education. So it's a very, very, in some ways, tragic combination of colonialism, education, racial and cultural hierarchies, and most importantly, human psychology and its need to compensate for violence, for humiliation, and its need to reconcile itself with the experiences of indignation. In some ways, Baba Mukuru is like those characters in A Question of Power, who I described as allegorical versions of Frantz Fanon's violent African men, men who use violence or who justify violence, not just in the question of national liberation, but also as a way of personal validation and personal rebuilding of the self. Or violence becomes, for a lot of these kinds of African men, a way of restoring that part of their selves which was dismembered or which was castrated, to use a masculine and violent metaphor, by the cultural dynamics and the hierarchies of colonialism. So, education has a role to play, but education enters a cultural matrix in which the movement towards violence has already been established. So, the point that the character of Baba Mukuru allows us to make is that in a cultural context like that of southern Rhodesia, what choice was there for men like Baba Mukuru? The choice was in how to take the Western English sensibilities and to use these sensibilities to create a more sustainable, helpful, caring, and progressive space for the people of Africa, specifically for the young children, and even more specifically for these girls who for many years had been confined to lives of domestic labor and drudgery. So how can Baba Mukuru use his position of privilege gained through his colonial education and make life better for others? His intentions are good. He does want to make life better for others. But as they say, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And he does create hell for people and for no one more so than for his own daughter Nyasha. Now, how does Baba Mukuru's good intention create hell for Nyasha? It creates hell for Nyasha specifically because, and I'll talk about one instance in which he bans the reading of certain kinds of books and requires only that certain other kinds of books be read. This comes from a very, very religious, moralistic view, which in turn comes from a very racist idea that the natives of places like Africa and even India, the African and the South Asian subcontinent, natives in these places could be placated or in some ways culturally tranquilized or drugged into a state of inactivity, which is to say, to distract natives from rebelling against colonial rule. One very effective strategy was religion, to teach the natives to be submissive, obedient, and children of God, and this kind of ideological things. This was a part of the religious and soft power arms of these colonial governments. And we are all familiar with what kind of language these missionary organizations used. Now, it's important to be clear that these missionary organizations were working in a very particular context. There's no reason for someone like Baba Mukuru, someone who doesn't have any material or economic ties with the British government, there's no way in which Baba Mukuru would benefit from having a younger generation of African girl children imbibe those submissive ideas of religious Christian morality. And yet, despite not having these economic ties, the cultural indoctrination of Baba Mukuru is so deep and so entrenched that he truly believes that the only way these girl students and children can have good lives is if they imbibe wholeheartedly, lock, stock, and barrel, the religious and moralistic ideas that he had imbibed in his own time as a as a child in the colonial African missionary convent style education. And when he runs his own missionary organization, his own educational institution, he tries to enforce in quite a military and almost dictatorial style these preferences and these rules for reading. And the one book which produces a lot of violence because he finds that someone, and Nyasha included, is reading that book is D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. Now, those of you who are familiar with the history of the English novel and history of modernism and censorship and publication know that Lady Chatterley's Lover, like James Joyce's Ulysses, was an important landmark in the history of 20th century English novels, but also in the history of censorship in England, because it led to a very public debate on obscenity, pornography, and what kinds of liberties fiction writers could take if their stated goal was to produce works of fiction that were truly edifying, that served a very nationally recognized, valued purpose, which was that reading novels or reading literature could make us all more sensitive, more empathetic, and more aware of the things that matter. So, a kind of moral education. So, if the goal of reading novels and indirectly, therefore, of writing novels was to edify and morally educate the general public, then could the fiction writer take liberties and describe things like sexual relations between individuals. A lot of people felt that this was not allowed, that this was a mistaken understanding of what kind of liberties a novelist could take. Some people, however, argued that in some cases, the novelist did have the right and had earned the right through their writing to describe things like sexual relations in varying degrees of detail. Now, the rejoinder to this, because the courts, the judges in England declared that even though it appears that the objectionable sections in Lady Chatterley's Lover, the novel by D.H. Lawrence, that even though some sections were indeed obscene and did indeed fit the description of pornographic or obscene writing, it could be possible that the writer, D.H. Lawrence, through his contributions to literature and through his dedication to writing novels, but also writing works of literary criticism and his general advocacy of literature, had earned the right to be excused for some such descriptions. And the summary of this idea was that because the novel contains other sections, other instances where the moral, philosophical, or otherwise intellectual value of fiction is affirmed, some sections which contain obscene or pornographic descriptions can be allowed to exist, and therefore the book may not be banned. The backlash against this judgment, which was voiced in several conservative newspapers in England, was that why should judges be the final arbiters, or why should a court exercise aesthetic judgment and not the people themselves? And one newspaper, I think it was the Times, very famously joked that why should the judges have the only right to read dirty books, and why not let the people read the books and then decide? The people had in fact decided, and they did consider Lady Chatterley's Lover to be an obscene book. Now, returning to Nervous Conditions, Baba Mukuru has not followed the story to its end and probably has not read through the different perspectives and the different opinions, and especially the different dissenting opinions and the final judgment in the public debate on whether or not Lady Chatterley's Lover was an obscene book. He bans it violently, and he decrees that the only reading would be history books written by historians who were writing before the late 20th century feminist revival of history writing. So not the kind of history books that scholars like Joan Scott would write, not history books which acknowledged the importance of gender differences, not history books which recognized that traditional historians have been writing from a masculine perspective. That is to say, only questions and stories of wars, succession, the male lineage, male genealogy, the names of male kings and princes. This was one very, very conservative way of writing history. And Baba Mukuru decrees that only these kinds of books would be allowed for reading, other than books that helped inculcate a very, very obedient and docile Christian sensibility. Nothing other than this, and especially not novels, and definitely not novels which, in the name of human or moralistic development, tried to inculcate a very different sort of sensibility. Now, this moment reminds us of several other moments in 20th century novels in which the discussion around whether or not a book can be read and what sort of value the book can have seems to have momentous consequences for the trajectory along which a character develops. The most famous instance in a 20th century novel, even though it was published around the turn of the century, but there are editions that appeared in the year 1900, is the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, in which Dorian Gray's transition from being a somewhat harmless youth who engaged in some flirtatious and risky behavior to someone who became a downright dangerous criminal and someone who actively broke the law and someone who became quite violent and insensitive to the suffering of others, someone who turned quite sadistic in the violence that he inflicted on others. That transition in the picture of Dorian Gray is marked by the exchange of a book, by a book that Dorian Gray is gifted, and that book is Rabu, or Against Nature. And Against Nature, of course, is a very telling title because the crimes that Oscar Wilde would be accused of would be crimes against nature. That is, queerness or the choice made by a man to engage in intimacy with another man was seen as a crime because it was against the natural design and functioning of human bodies as it was handed down from God, and as a lot of religious and legal commentators believed should be the case. So this is one instance, but even going back to the earliest instance, that is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which in some ways is the paradigmatic Bildungsroman. The first chapter of Jane Eyre also contains a very violent event which involves a book. A book is hurled at Jane while she is trying to find sanctuary in the Red Room. And this book is hurled at her by Mrs. Reed's son. And this book leaves a very violent mark, a scar on Jane's head. So, refusing to read and struggling to read books has always been a very powerful determinant of the path that an individual's growth takes, and we see this happen in nervous conditions as well. I'll stop this lecture here, wrap up this discussion in the next one, and continue with the next novelist. Thank you.